My name is Elena Vargas, and if you're sitting down with a warm cup of coffee right now, I want you to take a slow sip and just breathe with me for a moment. I'm 36 years old, and for a long time, I forgot what it felt like to just sit in a room without waiting for the walls to cave in. Have you ever lived like that? Like you're constantly holding your breath, trying to keep a storm from breaking over everyone else's head, even when you didn't invite the rain? If you know exactly what it feels like to quietly earn your place in a room where your presence is treated like an inconvenience, type the word boundaries in the comments right now. I see you and I understand. A year after the divorce was finalized, I thought the worst of the wreckage was behind me. I had packed up my life, moved to Albuquerque, and poured every remaining ounce of my energy into my work as a nurse manager. But a lie has a funny way of hunting you down, especially when the people who built it are terrified of it cracking. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just past dawn, and I had just finished a brutal 14-hour shift managing critical patients at Mesa Vista Regional Medical Center. If you've ever worked in healthcare, or if you've ever pushed your body past the point of exhaustion for a job, you know that heavy, hollow ache in your bones. My feet were burning inside my nursing shoes. My hands smelled faintly of harsh antibacterial sanitizer, and my faded navy scrubs were rumpled. I wanted nothing more than to walk to my car, drive to my quiet adobe house in the foothills, and sit in the silence. I was standing near the elevator banks of the cardiac intensive care unit, waiting for the metal doors to slide open when a voice cut through the quiet hum of the corridor. It was a sharp, practiced voice, one that carried a distinct inherited authority. "Leaving you was the best decision Daniel ever made," Patricia Whitaker announced. I turned around. My former mother-in-law stepped directly into my path, completely blocking the elevator panel. She didn't lower her voice. In fact, she projected it, ensuring a nearby respiratory therapist and two anxious visitors waiting by the directory board heard every single word. She stood there holding a designer leather handbag over her forearm, wearing a tailored linen blouse and a heavy silver squash blossom necklace. She looked entirely out of place in our clinical, sterile environment, looking as though she had walked straight out of a charity luncheon in Santa Fe. She offered me a tight, polished smile that didn't even come close to reaching her eyes. "Daniel is engaged to Kelsey now," Patricia continued, her tone dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my stomach turn. "She is warm, she is family-centered, and most importantly, Elena, she is not married to a hospital bedpan. You always did look more comfortable with dying strangers than with your own husband." She stood there, waiting for the public humiliation to break me. For 3 years of marriage, she had fed me the dark, heavy guilt that my demanding career was the sole reason her son was unhappy. She wanted me to lower my head, stare at the scuffed linoleum, and walk away carrying the same heavy shame I had swallowed during our mediation hearings. She expected a frantic defense or a tearful retreat because my pain validated her narrative. She needed me to be the broken, discarded ex-wife to justify the beautiful new life she was constructing for her son. But she didn't realize the days of me absorbing the Whitaker family blame were over. When a family member yells in a waiting room, my training kicks in. You don't yell back. You triage their emotion. You recognize that their hostility is usually a symptom of their own underlying fear. I kept my hands at my sides, resisting the urge to cross my arms defensively. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify my choices. I looked directly into her eyes, matching her calculated chaos with an unyielding professional stillness. "Is that what you believe, Patricia?" I asked. My voice was calm, even, and entirely devoid of the shame she was begging to see. If you've ever had to quietly sit through a family gathering while someone casually dissected your Character under the guise of concern, do me a favor and type the word truth in the comments below. Let me take you back into that bright, sterile hallway because before you can understand why Patricia Whitaker lost all the color in her face just 5 minutes later, you need to understand the architecture of the lie I lived in for 3 years. When you manage a floor of failing hearts, you learn a vital psychological lesson. You learn to strip away the background noise and focus strictly on what keeps a person breathing. But back when I was married to Daniel, I hadn't learned how to apply that clinical triage to my own life. I was operating under a heavy, unspoken rule that dictates so many women's lives. The belief that if you just work a little harder, sleep a little less, and absorb a little more blame, you can eventually earn your place at the table. I became useful to the Whitaker family, but I was never truly wanted. There is a profound, aching difference between those two things, isn't there? When you are useful, people love what you can do for them, what you can absorb for them, and how your silence makes their lives run smoother. But the moment you ask to be seen, the moment your boundaries inconvenience their comfort, your usefulness expires, and you are cast as the villain. Looking back, the signs were always there, hidden in the everyday, relatable routines of our life in Las Cruces. I remember the absolute exhaustion of that final year. I would finish a grueling night shift, my mind still racing from coordinating emergency codes, and I would sit in my car in the driveway, staring at the steering wheel, forcing myself to breathe before walking through the front door. Inside the house, a different kind of vigil was waiting for me. I spent 18 months tracking my temperature on wrinkled paper charts, scheduling invasive diagnostic appointments, and checking off ovulation calendars with a sinking sense of dread. Every single month, when the test came back negative, a suffocating silence would settle over our home. Daniel wouldn't yell. He was a master of a much quieter cruelty. The heavy sigh, the turned back in bed, the casual comment about how his friends from the dealership were all busy building real families while he was left sitting in an empty house. And then came the family dinners at Patricia's immaculate home. "It's such a shame your schedule is so demanding, Elena," Patricia said at dinner, her eyes fixed on my plate. "A husband needs a wife who is present, not someone who prefers night shifts over her own home. Your biological clock won't wait for your career." Daniel just stared silently at his plate, cutting his steak with precise, rhythmic motions, completely detached from the trap his mother was setting for me. He didn't defend me. He didn't say a word. I sat there, my throat tight, swallowing the bitter assumption that my body was failing, that my clinical life was a punishment, and that I was single-handedly destroying the Whitaker family lineage. When the marriage finally collapsed under the weight of that unyielding isolation, I packed my bags and moved to Albuquerque, naively believing that the divorce papers would grant me a clean break. But Patricia Whitaker didn't just want a divorce for her son. She wanted an absolute execution of my reputation to secure his future standing. In a close-knit community like the one we inhabited in Las Cruces, status is currency, and narratives are managed like corporate PR campaigns. Patricia was deeply entrenched in the local charity boards, the neighborhood committees, and the social hierarchy of the parish we attended every Sunday. Long before the ink on our mediation agreement was even dry, she had systematically weaponized my personality against me. She went to the women of the Altar Society, to our mutual friends, and to anyone who would listen, crafting a devastating, highly polished portrait of a cold, ambitious, careers-obsessed woman who had selfishly refused to start a family. She told them I had rejected couples counseling, preferring the isolation of the hospital corridors over the hard work of saving my marriage. Have you ever watched a lie move through a room? It doesn't move with a roar. It moves like a draft, chilling everything it touches. I remember walking out of Mass during my final weeks in town, watching couples I had known for years suddenly turn their heads to avoid eye contact. I remember losing mutual friends who quietly stopped returning my texts, deciding it was simply easier to believe the wealthy, influential matriarch than to risk asking the ex-wife for the truth. By the time I stood across from Daniel at the glossy mahogany mediation table, I was so hollowed out by the collective blame that I barely fought back. I listened to his lawyers calculate the division of our assets, while Daniel sat there looking tired and victimized, entirely comfortable letting me carry the heavy, dark shame of our failed marriage. I accepted the role of the villain because I thought that packing my bags, pitting my bags, and retreating to Albuquerque would finally buy me peace. I thought that if I let them keep their perfect version of the story, they would leave me alone in the quiet life I was trying to rebuild. But standing in that hospital corridor a year later, looking at Patricia's smug, triumphant smile, I realized a terrifying truth about manipulative people. They are never truly satisfied with your retreat. They don't just want to win. They need to revisit your defeat over and over again to ensure their lie remains securely anchored to the ground. If you have ever reached a moment in your life where something inside you simply clicked, where you realized that you were done lighting yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, type the word release in the comments right now. Standing in that hallway, looking at Patricia, I felt the last lingering threads of the old, familiar shame dissolve. My 3 years of marriage had been a masterclass in passive compliance, but my training as a critical care nurse manager had taught me something far more valuable: how to read a crisis. In the unit, when a monitor alarms or a patient's pressure drops, you don't panic. You don't let the emotional noise in the room dictate your next move. You look at the data. You isolate the systemic failure and you treat the actual wound. For the first time, I looked at Patricia Whitaker through a clinical lens rather than a personal one. I didn't see a powerful, untouchable matriarch holding court in her designer linen blouse and heavy silver squash blossom necklace. I saw a symptom. I saw a woman performing an aggressive act of territorial dominance because she was deeply, intrinsically terrified of losing control over her audience. Her smug smile, her loud projection of Daniel's engagement to Kelsey, her public insults. They weren't signs of strength. They were defensive mechanisms. "Is that what you believe, Patricia?" I asked, again, keeping my voice perfectly level. Before she could recover her footing or deliver another rehearsed insult, the heavy, secure double doors of the cardiac intensive care unit swung open behind her. Dr. Matteo Sandoval walked into the elevator bay. Matteo was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Mesa Vista Regional, a man who routinely held beating human hearts in his hands. He wore a crisp white lab coat over his dark surgical scrubs, his stethoscope draped casually around his neck. He carried the quiet, undeniable authority of someone who didn't need to raise his voice or perform for an audience to command respect. He was brilliant, fiercely protective of the nursing staff, and possessed a rare, grounding warmth that instantly cut through the sterile tension of the hospital. When Matteo saw me standing near the elevator, his serious, focused expression vanished, dissolving into a warm, genuine smile. He walked directly toward me, bypassing Patricia entirely as if she were nothing more than a piece of hospital furniture left in the corridor. "Elena," he said, his voice rich and familiar. He didn't use my formal clinical title. He didn't treat me like a passing colleague. He stepped into my personal space, effectively closing the gap Patricia had tried to dominate. He reached out and placed his hand gently on the small of my back, a casual, undeniable gesture of quiet intimacy that made the ambient tension in my shoulders begin to evaporate. I was hoping to catch you before you left for the morning. Dinner is still on for tonight, right? I picked up the ingredients for that green chili stew you like. I smiled up at him, feeling a profound sense of safety wash over me. Dinner sounds perfect, Matteo, I replied. Matteo turned his head, finally acknowledging Patricia. His sharp, analytical eyes assessed her rigid posture, her designer handbag, and the hostility radiating from her tight jaw. He didn't know the history, but he could read the psychological temperature of a room instantly. He looked back at me, his hand resting securely against my spine, his tone shifting into a subtle, protective register. Everything okay here, Elena? Patricia stared at the hand on my back. She stared at the embroidered title on the pocket of his white coat, and then her eyes dropped to my left hand, resting against my scrub pants. The bright, overhead fluorescent lights caught the facets of the diamond engagement ring I had been wearing for exactly 2 months. All the color drained from Patricia's face. The polished Santa Fe matriarch suddenly looked incredibly pale and terribly small under the sterile hallway lights. The narrative she had clung to, the comforting story of the bitter, isolated, unlovable nurse who wept over her failed marriage, shattered completely against the reality standing right in front of her. She realized in that exact second that I didn't need her son, I didn't miss her family, and I was highly valued by a man who commanded the very institution we were standing in. I'm completely fine, Matteo, I said, my voice steady, clear, and ringing out down the corridor. Patricia was just leaving. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She took a clumsy, defensive step backward, her designer bag slipping down her forearm, completely stripped of her theatrical confidence. But as I watched her flounder, my nurse's intuition picked up on a secondary shift. The panic in her eyes wasn't just about my engagement ring. It was deeper, more frantic. It was the desperate anxiety of a strategist who realized her target was positioned exactly where a hidden landmine was about to detonate. If you've ever seen a manipulative person realize they've completely lost control of a situation, you know that they rarely retreat quietly. Instead, they escalate. They change the rules of the game, looking for any possible leverage to pull you back down into the mud with them. Type the word control in the comments if you've lived through that specific escalation. The quiet chime of the elevator cut through the heavy silence of the corridor, and the metal doors slid open. I expected to see an empty car, but instead, my past stepped right out into my present. Daniel, my ex-husband, stepped forward, wearing a wrinkled navy polo shirt, his shoulders slumped with the exhausted posture of a man running on pure adrenaline. Beside him, clutching a cardboard carrier holding 2 iced coffees, stood a young woman with perfectly pressed blonde hair and a nervous, overwhelmed expression. It was Kelsey. Daniel froze mid-step, his eyes flicking from my face to Matteo's hand, which was still resting protectively on the small of my back. He blinked, caught completely off guard, his gaze drifting inevitably to the diamond ring, catching the harsh, fluorescent light. His jaw tightened instantly, a muscle feathering in his cheek as he swallowed hard. Daniel had spent our entire divorce mediation claiming my clinical nature made me impossible to love, walking away expecting to be the only one upgrading his life. Seeing me valued, respected, and undeniably moved on was a blow to his ego he couldn't mask quickly enough. Patricia didn't miss a single beat. Recognizing the sudden, dangerous shift in the hallway's power dynamic, she stepped forward to intercept them, instantly attempting to reclaim the narrative. Daniel, Kelsey, sweetheart, you made it up here, Patricia announced, her voice artificially bright, pitched loud enough to dominate the entire elevator bay. She reached out, placing a manicured hand on Kelsey's arm and physically pulling the younger woman into the tense circle. She looked directly at me, her smile tight and razor-thin. "Alina, this is Kelsey, Daniel's real second chance." It was a line designed to cut. An ordinary, calculated cruelty meant to remind me that I was nothing more than a failed first attempt. But the insult hung poorly in the silent corridor, completely devoid of the devastating impact she had anticipated. Kelsey shifted her grip on the cardboard coffee carrier, offering a hesitant, deeply uncomfortable nod. Her eyes darted from my faded scrubs to my identification badge, and then to Mateo. I could see her actively processing a severe cognitive dissonance. For the past year, Patricia had likely painted a vivid portrait of a bitter, isolated woman who wept in hospital break rooms. Kelsey had been prepared to meet a miserable, lonely workaholic. Instead, she was looking at a calm, composed nurse manager standing shoulder to shoulder with the chief of cardiothoracic surgery. "Hey, Elena," Daniel murmured, attempting to sound indifferent. But his eyes betrayed his panic as he looked at the embroidered title on Mateo's white coat. Mateo didn't offer a polite, superficial greeting. He shifted seamlessly into the authoritative professional who dictated the rhythm of this hospital. He stepped slightly forward, addressing Daniel with calm, clinical precision. "I understand you are here for Richard," Mateo said. "Your father was admitted through the ER a few hours ago with unstable chest pain. His cardiac enzyme levels are elevated, and the initial catheterization shows significant blockages. He requires a thorough surgical evaluation to determine if a bypass is the safest route." Mateo paused, letting the medical reality settle over the family before drawing a strict ethical boundary. "Given my personal relationship with Elena, I want to ensure you feel entirely comfortable with his care. I can step back right now and have Dr. Nina Caldwell, one of our top surgeons, take over the primary consult and any potential procedure. Your father's health and your family's peace of mind are the priority here." It was a masterclass in professional integrity. Mateo didn't leverage his position to intimidate. He offered them a choice, prioritizing medical ethics over petty hallway politics. Daniel looked incredibly small standing there, holding his car keys, his indifferent facade crumbling under the weight of his father's failing heart. But Patricia wasn't looking at the medical reality. She was looking at a threat to her social status. She stepped sideways, positioning herself directly in my path, her eyes burning with sudden, desperate hostility. "You think wearing those scrubs gives you the right to control who stands by his bed?" Patricia hissed, her maternal facade cracking completely. She reached into her designer handbag and withdrew a single, folded sheet of heavy ivory paper, shoving it toward my chest. "You are going to sign this statement right now, Elena. It states that the divorce was a mutual, amicable misunderstanding and that you fully support Daniel and Kelsey. If you don't, I will take this straight to the hospital auxiliary board. I know the donor circle that funds Dr. Sandoval's research wing, and I will make sure they hear a very detailed account of how their chief surgeon is having an inappropriate relationship with a vindictive nurse manager who stalks patient families." I stared at the paper, a cold weight dropping into my stomach. 5 minutes after her defining lie had been challenged by my mere existence, she was standing in my hallway, attempting to extort my signature to preserve her fabricated reality. If you've ever had to stand your ground against someone who is trying to twist the rules to make you look like the problem, type the word integrity in the comments. Have you ever noticed how manipulative people always demand a clean version of history the exact second their power begins to slip away from them? I didn't reach for the ivory paper. Patricia was shoving toward my chest. I didn't get defensive, and I didn't let the slight tremor of anxiety in my chest dictate my posture. I relied entirely on the unyielding firewall of hospital protocol. "I am not signing anything, Patricia," I said, my voice steady, ensuring every syllable carried down the quiet corridor. "And I will not engage in unsupervised, spontaneous hallway negotiations regarding a patient's family status. If you have a formal grievance, we can address it through administrative channels." Before Patricia could launch into another theatrical threat about her wealthy donor circle, a calm, authoritative presence moved past our clustered group. Beverly Tate, the Director of Patient Relations and Risk Management, stepped into the elevator bay. Beverly navigated hospital crises with the unbothered efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of family dysfunction. She wore a tailored gray blazer and sensible rubber-soled shoes, carrying a sleek black tablet in her hands. Patricia spotted the institutional authority and instantly pivoted. She smoothed the front of her linen blouse, abandoning the harsh, venomous hiss she had used just a second ago. She adopted the polished, urgent outrage of a wealthy patron who expected her grievances to be handled quietly and severely. "Are you the administrator in charge?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying a practiced, breathless distress. "Because I need to file an immediate formal grievance. The nurse manager on this floor, Elena Vargas, is my son's ex-wife. She has deliberately inserted herself into my husband's critical care to cause emotional distress. Furthermore, the chief surgeon evaluating my husband is her current partner. They are coordinating this to intimidate my family, and I demand they both be completely removed from this floor." Daniel stood a few paces behind his mother, his arms crossed, nodding grimly to validate the dramatic accusation. Kelsey remained entirely silent, her gaze fixed securely on the linoleum floor, looking visibly overwhelmed by the sudden escalation. Beverly did not gasp. She did not offer a sympathetic apology. She tapped the screen of her tablet, her expression perfectly neutral. "I am Beverly Tate, Patient Relations," she said. "Mrs. Whitaker, I understand this is a highly stressful day for your family. However, we do not remove clinical staff based on volume or accusations. We evaluate facts. Let us clarify exactly what occurred. We are moving this discussion off the floor right now." Beverly guided us down the narrow corridor and into the family conference room, a cramped, windowless space designed for delivering difficult news in private. The walls were painted a muted institutional beige, decorated only with a cheap, faded landscape print of red mesas. A heavy vending machine hummed loudly in the hallway outside, creating a constant, vibrating bassline beneath the sudden heavy silence in the room. Beverly sat at the head of the small circular table, resting her tablet flat on the laminate surface. Mateo stood by the door, his arms crossed, maintaining a quiet, supportive distance. I sat opposite Beverly, while Patricia, Daniel, and Kelsey took the remaining chairs, clustering tightly together on the far side of the table like a united front. The external patient portal allows family members to submit urgent concerns directly to risk management, Beverly explained, her tone methodical and stripped of all emotion. She tapped the screen, bringing up a digital file. A formal written complaint was logged in our system exactly 34 minutes ago. It accuses Elena Vargas of stalking the Whitaker family on hospital grounds, using her access badge to bypass security and deliberately attempting to interfere with Richard Whitaker's medical care to inflict emotional distress. Patricia sat perfectly rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression carefully arranged into a mask of solemn, wounded dignity. She thought she had built the perfect trap. She thought that by filing a formal document, the institutional machinery of the hospital would automatically bend to her status and crush my career. I looked across the table at them, sharing a silent, heavy pause with the audience listening to this story. Have you ever sat in a room and watched someone lie with absolute confidence, knowing that they have no idea they've just walked directly into their own undoing? I kept my mouth shut. I forced myself to remain perfectly still, watching the power dynamic in the room prepare for a fundamental, irreversible shift. If you have ever witnessed a beautifully constructed lie collapse under the weight of an unyielding digital timestamp, type the word justice in the comments right now. Beverly Tate leaned forward, her finger hovering over the glowing glass of her tablet. The timeline is the issue, Mrs. Whitaker, she said, her voice dropping into a quieter, more serious register. 34 minutes ago, your husband, Richard, had barely been wheeled out of the ambulance bay. Elena was still logging her shift notes at the central desk. You claimed in the hallway that you spontaneously encountered her 5 minutes ago, which prompted this conflict. But this detailed, multi-paragraph complaint was drafted and submitted long before that supposed accidental meeting. Beverly turned the tablet, sliding it across the laminate table so the screen faced the Whitaker family. Furthermore, the complaint was not submitted under your name, Mrs. Whitaker. The portal requires a verified identity to log a grievance. This complaint was submitted under the email address registered to Kelsey Pike. Kelsey went entirely still. She stared at the blocks of text resting on the table. The boutique coffee cup in her hand tilted slightly, a drop of condensation slipping down the cardboard sleeve and hitting the laminate surface with a soft tap. I didn't write that, Kelsey said. Her voice wasn't defensive. It was the simple, flat statement of someone trying to process a sudden disruption in reality. Daniel immediately reached out, placing a heavy hand on Kelsey's shoulder, his fingers tightening. Babe, you're just overwhelmed. Hospitals make people crazy. You've been running on adrenaline since Dad got admitted. You probably started typing it in the waiting room and forgot. It was a clumsy, desperate attempt to smooth over the inconsistency, relying on the classic Whitaker tactic of dismissing a woman's reality by blaming her emotions. But Kelsey did not nod in agreement. She pulled her shoulder completely away from his grip, leaning closer to the tablet. She read a few lines aloud, her brow furrowing deeply. The individual in question has a documented history of clinical detachment and vindictive behavior toward her former marital family. I don't talk like that, Daniel, Kelsey said, her voice firming up. She slowly turned her head, looking past her fiancé, her gaze locking onto her future mother-in-law. Patricia, why does this sound exactly like the way you speak? Patricia offered a tight, patronizing smile, completely ignoring the accusation of forgery. We are a family, Kelsey, she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. We coordinate our efforts to protect each other. I used your portal access because Daniel was busy with the doctors and we needed a united front. It was simply family coordination. We have to protect Richard from her. You used my legal name and my professional email to file a fraudulent document without my consent, Kelsey stated. She stood up, the movement sharp and deliberate, putting physical distance between herself and the two people she was supposed to call family. She looked at Daniel, waiting for him to defend her, waiting for him to tell his mother that forging her name was unacceptable. But Daniel stared at the floor, rubbing the back of his neck, choosing his familiar cowardly path of least resistance. The heavy silence in the conference room was shattered by a sharp, urgent knock on the door. Marisol, the junior respiratory therapist, pushed the door open, her face flushed as she held a pager tightly in her hand. She looked directly at me. Alina, I am sorry to interrupt, Marisol said, breathing heavily. Richard's call light just flashed. He just spoke to his surgical team, and his bypass is scheduled for first thing tomorrow morning. But he refuses to sign the final surgical consent forms until the family is gathered. He asked Harold Medina to secure a neutral space. Richard wants everyone in the hospital chapel in exactly 10 minutes. The hospital chapel was a quiet, circular room on the first floor, designed for silent grief and desperate hope. The walls were painted a warm, earthy adobe color illuminated by soft, amber lighting. Carved wooden statues of saints rested in small alcoves, watching over rows of heavy oak benches. Patricia tried to transform it into a stage. She had intercepted 2 older women from our former Las Cruces parish, who happened to be visiting the hospital, inviting them into the chapel to act as human shields and reinforce her social compliance. She directed Daniel to sit in the front pew, leaving an empty space beside him for Kelsey. But when Kelsey walked in, flanked by her father, Vernon Pike, a retired county sheriff's deputy who had just arrived, she ignored the command. Vernon guided his daughter to a bench on the opposite side of the aisle, drawing a line of severed loyalty. Mateo and I took a seat in the very last row. Patricia stood in the center aisle, holding out her silver pen and the heavy ivory peace statement. "Alina, I am asking you in front of God and the people who care about us to put the past behind us," Patricia said, her voice carrying across the sacred space. "Sign this statement for Richard so he can go into surgery knowing the hostility is over. Give an old man some peace of mind." She was weaponizing a failing heart, framing my refusal to sign a fraudulent document as a cruel act. I felt the desperate, suffocating need to avoid public humiliation flare in my chest. I reached out my fingers, trembling slightly, preparing to take the pen just to escape the crushing weight of her performance. Before my fingers could brush the metal, Harold Medina slipped quietly into the bench beside me. The retired attorney didn't cause a disruption. He simply placed a single sheet of paper on the wooden bench between me and Patricia. "He asked to speak first," Harold said softly. Before Patricia could launch into a defense, the heavy wooden doors near the altar swung open. The transport orderly pushed a wheelchair into the amber light. Richard sat in the chair, a thin hospital blanket draped over his blue gown, his skin a pale, papery gray. But as the orderly parked the chair, Richard placed his hands firmly on the armrests and pushed himself upright. "Nobody signs anything," Richard said, his voice raspy but carrying an unyielding authority. "Nobody signs anything until I tell the truth." He looked at the women from the parish, then at Daniel, and finally at Kelsey. "Resting is what I did for too many years, Patricia. I sat at the head of the dining table while you systematically dismantled a woman's reputation to protect our son's pride." Richard reached into the pocket of his gown and withdrew a piece of hospital stationery. "My son Daniel cannot have biological children," Richard stated clearly, leaving no room for medical ambiguity. "He received a definitive diagnosis of severe male factor infertility 18 months before the divorce. He knew, my wife knew, and I knew." Daniel dropped his head into his hands, the crushing humiliation of public exposure hitting him instantly. "Alina did not refuse to start a family," Richard continued. "She spent over a year scheduling appointments and taking the blame while Patricia made comments about her career. And I sat there listening to the rumors spread because keeping the peace in my own home felt easier than having the courage to correct my wife. Medical privacy should not be dragged into a prayer circle," Patricia interrupted, her voice shrill and desperate. "This is a private tragedy." Harold Medina did not raise his voice. He simply lifted the worn leather folder from his lap, holding up the printed email exchange where Patricia had explicitly instructed Daniel, "Protect your pride. She already looks cold enough to carry it for both of you." The visual evidence obliterated any further denial. Patricia stared at the folder, her mouth open, completely stripped of her elegant narrative. She had lost the moral high ground. She had lost the room. Across the aisle, Kelsey sat perfectly still. The confusion and hesitation that had plagued her in the waiting room were completely gone, replaced by a cold, resolute clarity. She had watched the Whitaker family dynamic unfold in real time, witnessing the exact lengths to which they would go to protect their public image. She looked at Daniel, who remained hunched over in the front pew, refusing to meet her eye. Slowly, deliberately, Kelsey raised her left hand. She used her right thumb to slide the diamond engagement ring over her knuckle. She did not yell. She did not cause a scene. She simply held the ring in her palm for a moment, then walked toward the front of the room. She stopped at the edge of the pew, resting her hand on the polished wood, and placed the diamond ring on the bench, where it caught the amber light of the alcove. "I will not marry into a family that uses women as cover stories," Kelsey said, her voice cutting through the silent chapel. Daniel scrambled out of the pew the moment the ring hit the wood, his sullen posture evaporating into a frantic desperation. "Kelsey, wait! You can't just leave over this," he pleaded, trailing half a step behind her as she walked toward the exit. He began rapidly throwing excuses against the wall. "The doctors in Santa Fe told me the diagnosis wasn't 100% certain. I was waiting to tell you until we had a second opinion." When that failed to stop her, he pivoted the blame backward, gesturing wildly toward the back row. "Elena made me feel like less of a man. She was always working, always acting like my issues were just a clinical problem to solve. I couldn't be honest because she made me feel ashamed." Kelsey kept walking, her eyes fixed on the heavy wooden doors. Before Daniel could make another desperate accusation, Vernon Pike stepped forward. The retired deputy placed his broad shoulders squarely between his daughter and Daniel, acting as a physical, unyielding barrier. "She gave you her answer, son," Vernon said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man used to handling domestic disputes on rural highways. "Let her walk out that door." Daniel froze, his face pale and slick with sweat. He had finally encountered a boundary he could not manipulate or charm his way across. Patricia watched her son's engagement dissolve from the center aisle, her eyes blazing with an unrepentant, vindictive fire as she turned her fury entirely on me. She marched down the aisle, her heels striking the floorboards like hammer blows, stopping at the edge of my bench. "You planned this," Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with rage. "You colluded with Richard to humiliate Daniel and destroy his future just so you could upgrade your own life. You manipulated a sick old man to punish my son." Mateo did not raise his voice. He remained seated, resting his hand lightly over mine, his calm certainty cutting through her frantic accusations. "Elena did not need me to become someone worth respecting, Patricia," he stated simply. I stood up, refusing to engage in the chaotic emotional warfare she thrived on. I looked directly into her eyes. "You called me cold because I would not keep bleeding quietly for your son," I said, my voice steady, clear, and completely devoid of the guilt I had carried for years. "You needed a villain to protect his ego, and I was convenient. But I am done carrying your family's infections." I looked down at the wooden bench where the folded ivory peace statement rested. I reached down, picked it up, and folded it once neatly in half. I set it back down on the polished wood. Unsigned. Control of the story had permanently shifted from Patricia's aggressive fiction to the visible, documented reality resting on the bench. Near the back of the chapel, Beverly Tate stepped forward to enforce the strict protocol of the medical center. "Mrs. Whitaker," Beverly said, her tone stripped of any accommodating warmth. Hospital spaces are designed for patient care, not for resolving personal disputes. If you continue to disrupt these care spaces, your visitation privileges will be restricted and your access to the cardiac unit will be severely limited. Patricia stood completely isolated in the center aisle. Her husband had publicly confessed, her son's fiancée was walking out the door, and her friends from the parish had already slipped out, eager to carry the undisputed reality back to Las Cruces. The carefully curated lie had collapsed entirely. 3 months passed, bringing the slow, gradual thaw of spring to the high desert. The fallout from that night in the chapel was quiet but absolute. Kelsey returned the remaining engagement items through certified mail and never spoke to Daniel again. Without her, and without the protective buffer of his mother's manufactured stories, Daniel quietly moved back to Las Cruces, finding that the parish circle had grown polite but noticeably distant. Patricia faced the same quiet exile, voluntarily withdrawing from her social committees as the truth spread through hushed conversations. Richard survived the bypass surgery and committed himself to rehab. Last week, I found a plain white envelope in my mailbox containing a short, handwritten letter from him. He thanked me for not letting him die with the lie still sitting on his chest. I folded the letter, placed it in the bottom drawer of my desk, and closed it. Right now, I don't have to answer it. My mornings belong to the hospital again, but the weight I carry through the corridors is entirely my own. We are finalizing the plans for our wedding. A small, quiet gathering at a vineyard tucked against the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. There will be no performances, just the people who actually want to be there. I stepped away from the central desk, my identification badge swinging lightly against my scrubs as the morning sun crested the horizon, sending bright, clean light streaming through the wide windows of the unit. The monitors beeped in a steady, predictable rhythm. I looked down the long, polished hallway, feeling the deep, settled peace of a woman who finally understands the nature of healing. You cannot cure an infection by simply covering it up and hoping nobody sees the damage. You have to expose it to the light, clean it out, and let it breathe. If someone made you carry a wound that was never yours, type the word boundaries in the comments below and share how you finally stopped covering for them. Let's clean it out together.